Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where velvet gowns brush against cold stone floors, and the flicker of torchlight plays tricks on your eyes. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax and ambition, and somewhere, deep inside this castle, a woman waits one who can match any king in cunning and surpass him in nerve. This is not a fairy tale court with harmless crowns and harmless smiles. No. This is a place where a single whispered command can send armies marching or seal the fate of a prince before sunrise. And here's your first reality check. You probably won't survive this if you try to play her game. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments your location and what time it is where you are right now. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the damp corridors of a 12th century English fortress, the air biting at your skin. The stone walls seem to listen to your footsteps, as if eager to carry your presence to ears you would rather not alert. Ahead, the great hall glows faintly with firelight, but it is not the king who commands here. It is Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, and claimant to the English throne. She is a figure carved from equal parts steel and pride. She has been called haughty, aloof, and utterly uncompromising, but those words fall short when you see her eyes sharp enough to cut through plate armor and patient enough to wait years for her strike. The mainstream fact is easy enough to see. In the 1132nd, England descended into a civil war known as the Anarchy, sparked by the question of whether Matilda or her cousin Stephen should rule. But this isn't just a tale of family squabbles. This is a masterclass in calculated persistence. When Stephen seized the crown, many thought Matilda's claim was finished. They underestimated how long she could hold a grudge and how far she would travel to reclaim what she saw as hers. You arrive at a council meeting she has called, though calling it a meeting is like calling a siege a minor inconvenience. She doesn't pace. She sits perfectly still, letting others twist in the silence. Her hand rests lightly on the arm of the chair, but you can tell if she could, she would grip the throne itself. She speaks slowly, her voice measured, each word cutting through the air, like a whetted blade. The men around her nod, but their eyes flicker half in awe, half in fear. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the height of winter, 1141, Matilda was besieged in Oxford Castle. Rather than surrender, she dressed in white to blend into the snow and escaped at night across the frozen River Thames. Think about it. Your average medieval noblewoman might spend winter huddled by a fire. Matilda turned it into a camouflage operation worthy of any modern spy film. If she had an Instagram, it would have been the ultimate number escape goals. Still, historians argue whether her downfall was due to her own arrogance or the treachery of allies. Some paint her as too inflexible to win the wavering loyalties of the nobility. Others insist her failure was the result of an entrenched patriarchy that could not stomach the idea of a ruling woman. Either way, when you watch her now, there's no sign she accepts blame for anything except trusting people too much, which, for her, means trusting them at all. You follow her into a private chamber after the council, where maps are spread across a table. The waxy smell of candles mixes with the tang of iron ink. She taps one corner, where a minor baron has grown too bold. "We'll take him at dawn," she says, as if she were ordering more bread for the kitchens. There is no drama, no fanfare, just the calm certainty of someone who knows she's the sharpest mind in the room. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the power shifts by degrees, drawn not from the clash of swords but from the precision of her words. This is Matilda's battlefield, yes. She commands troops, but her greatest victories are measured in grudging alliances, delayed betrayals, and the slow, grinding wear on her enemy's patience. You realize she is not fighting for a single win but for the long game, the kind where opponents simply wear out and collapse under the weight of her will. As you leave the chamber, one of her ladies-in-waiting passes by, balancing a tray of wine and bread. You can't help but notice the lady's ring bears the sigil of a family that supposedly supports King Stephen. Either Matilda is keeping her enemies closer, or she has turned them into assets without them even realizing it. You suspect it's both. Later, in the dim corridors, you overhear soldiers speaking in hushed tones about the Empress's white cloak and how she walked across the ice without leaving a mark. They speak of her as if she were part ghost, part queen, part warlord, a combination even the boldest knight would hesitate to challenge. And as you step into the cold night air, you understand something essential. Matilda doesn't need to sit on the throne to rule. She's already reshaping England from the shadows, moving pieces on a board the king doesn't even realize he's playing. In the end, she will secure her legacy not by wearing the crown herself, but by ensuring her son, Henry II, will. For now, though, she pulls her cloak tighter and vanishes into the hall, a figure of quiet fury and calculated brilliance. Somewhere behind her eyes, the next move is already unfolding, and you, lucky to have survived this close, are left wondering whether you were a guest, a witness, or just another pawn in her endless game. You wake to the rustle of banners and the murmur of foreign tongues drifting in from the courtyard. The scent of rosemary and horse sweat mingles in the cool morning air, a reminder that this castle is more crossroads than fortress. This is Poitiers, and the woman who commands its walls is not a queen who stays still. She is Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess by birth, Queen of France by marriage, Queen of England by remarriage, and political storm by choice. She sweeps into the hall like she owns the place, which, inconveniently for everyone else, she does. Her gown is a rich, deep red, the kind of colour that makes the men in the room forget their own names. She takes her seat not as an ornament beside a king, but as the gravitational centre of the court. The mainstream fact here is undeniable. Eleanor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of the Middle Ages, controlling vast lands and using her marriages to two different kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, to shape European politics for decades. You trail behind her as she greets a delegation from Toulouse. The conversation is light at first. Wine harvests, falconry, the quality of the silk shipments from the east. But watch closely. Every nod, every sip of wine, every casual compliment is placed with surgical precision. Eleanor isn't making small talk. She's laying a web of obligations. These men will leave thinking they've had a pleasant morning. In truth, they've been recruited into her chessboard. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Eleanor once joined her ladies-in-waiting in riding astride like men during the Second Crusade, a choice so scandalous that chroniclers nearly choked on their ink. It wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a calculated declaration. She wasn't going to the Holy Land to sit quietly in a tent. She would ride into negotiations and danger on her own terms. Imagine the medieval gossip columns. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's true talent lay in diplomacy or manipulation. Some paint her as the great patroness of the arts, fostering troubadours and the ideals of courtly love. Others suggest the poetry was just camouflage, a pleasant distraction while she maneuvered armies and influenced succession plans. Either way, when you stand near her, the distinction hardly matters because in Eleanor's presence, you're either part of her plan or an obstacle in her path. Later that afternoon, you find yourself in the gallery, overlooking the tilt-yard. Knights are sparring below, the clash of steel ringing against the stone walls. Eleanor leans on the railing beside you, her eyes fixed not on the combat but on the crowd. She is measuring loyalties, who cheers for whom, who leans close to whisper in another's ear. She notices patterns no one else does, the kind that will determine who gets an invitation to her next council and who finds themselves suddenly out of favour. Her conversation skips lightly from the price of Venetian glass to the necessity of securing Aquitaine's borders. You can't help but feel she could, if pressed, explain both the best way to pair wine with venison and the best way to starve an enemy garrison into submission. When she laughs, it is warm, but the warmth is like sunlight on a winter day, bright but incapable of melting ice when she doesn't want it to. That evening, the great hall fills for a feast. Music swirls, Candles drip wax onto the trestle tables, and Eleanor moves among her guests with a goblet in hand. You notice she spends more time speaking with lesser nobles than the great lords. At first it seems odd, until you realize she's weaving a network beneath the notice of the most powerful men in the room. A lesser noble is often hungrier for advancement, and therefore more loyal than a duke with his own ambitions. Eleanor knows this. She's building an army that doesn't carry swords, but secrets. As the night deepens, a troubadour sings a song of distant love, and Eleanor listens, eyes half closed. You think for a moment she is lost in sentiment. Then you see her hand slip a folded parchment to a passing servant. No one else notices, and you pretend you didn't. When you finally retreat to your chamber, the murmur of the hall still echoing, you understand the danger she poses. Eleanor doesn't need to depose kings to wield power. She just has to keep them close enough to believe they're leading, while she quietly shapes the world around them. By morning, she will be gone to another court, another alliance, another plan already unfolding, and you still catching your breath realize that following her is like chasing the wind, exhilarating, impossible, and just dangerous enough to make you wonder whether you've been swept into her current on purpose. The air in the royal apartments of Westminster feels heavy, like a storm about to break. The tapestries along the walls ripple faintly in the draught from the half-open shutters, and somewhere below, the sound of horses clattering on cobblestones rises up. You have the uneasy sense that this is not a morning for pleasantries. Isabella of France, once a teenage bride brought from Paris to marry England's Edward II, sits at a long table littered with parchment, wax seals, and an untouched goblet of wine. They call her the she-wolf of France. You can see why. Her face is composed, almost serene, but her eyes are fixed in the way a hunting cat fixes on its prey. The mainstream fact is stark. In 1326, Isabella, estranged from her husband and allied with her lover Roger Mortimer, led an invasion of England, captured Edward II, and effectively removed him from the throne. She didn't just whisper in shadows, she marched an army right to the king's doorstep. You stand at the edge of the room as messengers enter, bow, and speak quickly in low tones. Isabella listens without interruption, her hands folded neatly on the table. When she finally speaks, it's with a voice as smooth as silk, but carrying the edge of drawn steel. The plan is simple. Cut off the king's loyalists before they can rally, control London, and ensure the coronation of her young son, Edward III, under her guidance. Here's your quirky tidbit. Isabella had a knack for using fashion as propaganda. During her exile in France, she reportedly appeared in public dressed in widow's weeds, presenting herself as the wronged, abandoned wife, never mind that her husband was still very much alive. It was a costume worthy of a stage, and it worked. Public sympathy swelled, turning her personal feud into a righteous cause in the eyes of many. Imagine medieval Instagram flooded with moody black and white portraits and captions about betrayal. Historians still argue whether she was driven by personal revenge, political necessity, or a broader vision for England's future. Some cast her as a patriot saving the realm from an incompetent monarch. Others see her as an ambitious schemer whose motives began and ended with her own power. Standing here, it's hard to tell. Perhaps it's both, or perhaps she simply refuses to let history box her in. By midday, you accompany her to the council chamber, where Mortimer stands at her side. It's clear he knows his place close enough to advise, never close enough to outshine. Isabella lets the lords speak first, watching them like a cat watches birds. Then she delivers her orders in a calm, measured tone that brooks no dissent. Every directive is calculated, every ally rewarded just enough to keep them loyal without letting them grow strong enough to challenge her. That night, the city hums with rumors. In taverns and alleyways, people whisper of the queen who has turned against her king. Some say she is a savior, others call her a traitor, but everyone agrees on one thing: she is dangerous. In the privacy of her chamber, she studies a map of England, the candlelight throwing long shadows across her face. You catch a glimpse of a small, satisfied smile barely there, gone in a heartbeat. Days later, Edward II is in custody, and Isabella walks through the corridors of the tower as if they've always belonged to her. She does not rush. She glides, as though each step is a reminder to everyone watching that she has remade the balance of power in her own image. You realize with a shiver that her danger lies not in sudden bursts of violence, but in the patience and precision with which she strikes. The crown on her son's head may be lighter than the one she might have taken for herself, but make no mistake, every decision he makes will bear her fingerprints. And somewhere in the shadows of this cold, echoing fortress, the she-wolf sharpens her claws for the next move. The sea air here is sharper, saltier, with a sting that catches in your throat as you cross the wooden planks leading into the fortress at Helsingborg. The banners of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden snap above the ramparts, 3 kingdoms stitched together by one woman's will. This is Margaret I of Denmark, and she is not the sort of ruler to sit contentedly on a single throne when she can command 3. She was never meant to hold such power. Born in 1353, the youngest daughter of King Valdemar IV of Denmark, Margaret was married off at just 10 years old to King Håkon VI of Norway. To most, that might have been the end of her political story, an exchange of noble bloodlines, a pawn on the board. But Margaret was no pawn. The mainstream fact, by 1397, through a series of shrewd alliances, military maneuvers, and deft negotiations, she created the Kalmar Union, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown. The official ceremony made it look neat and orderly, but in truth, it was a masterclass in quiet domination. You arrive in her audience chamber just as a delegation from Sweden enters. Their expressions are a careful mix of deference and unease. The Swedes, proud and prickly, have long bristled under Danish influence. Margaret greets them with a warm smile that never quite reaches her eyes. Her voice is low, deliberate, the kind that makes you lean forward so you don't miss a word. She begins with small courtesies, asking about the harvest, the weather on their journey, but soon she's steering the conversation toward loyalty oaths, trade routes, and the delicate balance of military obligations. Here's your quirky tidbit. Margaret insisted on ruling as a queen regent for her adopted heir, rather than declaring herself queen outright. It was a clever bit of legal theatre. By pretending to hold power on behalf of someone else, she soothed egos, bypassed legal objections, and made it harder for rivals to accuse her of overreach. In reality, everyone knew who was truly in charge. It's the medieval equivalent of saying you're just helping out while you actually run the whole show. Historians still argue whether her goal was genuine Scandinavian unity, or simply the expansion of her personal power. Some believe she envisioned a strong, cooperative North that could stand against the German Hanseatic League. Others suggest she was merely tightening her grip on as much land and revenue as possible. Either way, she played the long game with a precision most kings could never manage. Later in the day, you walk with her along the battlements. The winter wind whips at her fur-lined cloak, but she moves steadily, scanning the harbour where ships from all 3 kingdoms are moored. They think the union is for peace, she murmurs, half to herself. But peace is not given, it is managed. You understand then that for Margaret, unity is not an ideal, it is a tool, one she sharpens daily. Back inside, a scribe unfurls a map of the Baltic. Her fingers trace the coastlines, pausing at key ports. You notice that her nails are neatly kept, her hands steady. She is a woman accustomed to control not just of her court, but of herself. When a Swedish noble voices a mild objection to her plans, she doesn't raise her voice. Instead, she tilts her head slightly and asks a question so pointed it leaves him stammering. By the time he regains his composure, she has already moved on to the next matter, effectively dismissing his challenge without ever naming it as such. As evening falls, the great hall is prepared for a feast. The tables are laden with smoked fish, root vegetables, and warm rye bread. Musicians tune their instruments, and the scent of pine boughs fills the air. Margaret sits at the high table, flanked by representatives from each kingdom. She toasts to prosperity, to shared futures, to the family of the North. The words are smooth, almost tender, but you can see in the flicker of her gaze that she is measuring who drinks readily and who hesitates. Later, as the feast thins out and the candles burn low, you catch sight of her in a quiet corner, speaking softly to a messenger. No one notices the exchange of a small scroll sealed in wax. You don't know what it contains, but you're certain it has nothing to do with the songs being sung at the other end of the hall. Margaret's danger lies in her ability to make conquest feel like cooperation. Her enemies often don't realize they've been subdued until it's far too late to resist. Even now, as the hall echoes with laughter and music, she is already thinking about the next decade, the next threat, the next opportunity to bind the North tighter still. You step outside into the night, the cold stars blazing above the frozen sea. Somewhere inside the fortress, Margaret is still awake, her candle burning late into the night, her mind moving faster than the ships in her harbours. And you realize that in the game of kings and queens, she has already won, not because she took the crown, but because she decided how it would be worn. The streets of Lyon are slick with morning rain, cobblestones glistening under a grey sky. You follow the sound of bells toward the royal palace, their tones deep and solemn, as if they know the queen you are about to meet thrives in turbulence. Inside, the scent of damp wool cloaks and oiled leather clings to the air. This is Queen Urraca of Lyon, Castile, a woman whose life is a storm contained in human form. Born in 1080, Urraca inherited the throne of Leon, Castile, and Galicia in 1109 after the death of her father, Alfonso VI. The mainstream fact is this: she ruled during a period of almost constant civil war, juggling rebellions, noble feuds, and an unsteady marriage to Alfonso I of Aragon, a union that quickly collapsed into open hostility. Most monarchs would have been crushed between such forces. Urraca found ways to turn them against each other instead. When you step into her audience chamber, she is already in the middle of a dispute. Two nobles stand before her, voices raised, accusing one another of treachery. Urraca listens without interruption, her chin slightly tilted, eyes flicking between them like a predator deciding which prey to strike first. When they finish, she speaks in a voice that carries to the back of the hall without shouting. She doesn't side with either man outright. Instead, she sets them both new, conflicting tasks, ensuring neither will have the time or resources to challenge her directly. Here's your quirky tidbit. Urraca's marriage breakdown with Alfonso of Aragon wasn't just a personal matter, it was a full-scale military problem. At one point, the two were literally at war with each other, while still technically married. Imagine the world's worst couples counseling, except instead of awkward silences, you have armies laying siege to cities. Chroniclers recorded that the pair would sometimes negotiate in the morning and exchange volleys of arrows in the afternoon. Historians still argue whether Urraca's fierce independence was a matter of necessity or temperament. Some portray her as a ruler forced into constant conflict by the dangerous men around her. Others insist she enjoyed the fight and sought it out when peace felt too constricting. Watching her now, you suspect both are true. Her composure is that of someone who has learned to live on the edge and refuses to step back. Later in the day, you walk with her along the rain-slick battlements. The wind whips her black cloak around her, but she does not flinch. She points toward the distant hills, where a rival noble's banner is said to have been spotted. "He will test me," she says evenly, "but he will not like the answer." There is no trace of doubt in her tone. It is simply a fact. Back in the council chamber, maps are spread across the table, weighted down with polished stones. Urraca leans over them, her finger tracing river routes and fortress lines. A scribe hovers nearby, scribbling notes as she dictates orders to secure supplies and shift troops. She does not consult her advisors so much as direct them, each man stepping forward to receive instructions before retreating silently. At dusk, the court gathers for a meal. The long tables are set with earthenware bowls of stewed lamb, and bread still warm from the ovens. Urraca sits at the center, speaking lightly to the bishop on her right while subtly watching the faces of those further down the table. When a knight boasts too loudly about his recent victory, she asks a deceptively simple question about the terms of his truce. His hesitation is all the answer she needs. By morning, she will have quietly shifted him away from command. After the meal, she retreats to a smaller chamber, lit by a single brazier. The shadows dance on the walls as she reads a letter brought by a trusted courier. The seal is broken with a swift twist, and her eyes scan the contents without visible reaction. When she finishes, she folds the parchment neatly and tucks it into her belt. Whatever it said, it has already been filed away in her mind, weighed against her plans, and given a place in her next move. You realize that Urraca's danger lies not in dramatic declarations or fiery speeches, but in her unflinching adaptability. She is as willing to forge alliances as she is to betray them, and she does both without a flicker of guilt. Every setback becomes a tool, every insult a reason to sharpen her strategy. When you finally leave the palace, the rain has stopped, and the streets gleam under the moonlight. Somewhere behind those high walls, Urraca is still awake, the map of her kingdoms etched in her mind, the next steps already unfolding. And you can't help but feel that as long as she sits on that throne, Castile is less a realm and more a blade balanced in her hand, pointed at anyone foolish enough to challenge her. The scent of the sea follows you inland here, carried on the wind like a reminder of the routes that brought both wealth and danger to this island kingdom. Palermo rises before you in warm golden stone, its streets humming with a blend of Norman, Arab, and Byzantine influences. This is the capital of Sicily, and at its heart sits Queen Constance, daughter of Roger II, last legitimate heir of the Norman kings, and a woman whose claim to the throne is as perilous as the waters around it. Born in 1154, Constance of Sicily was cloistered in a convent for much of her youth, sworn to religious life to keep her safely out of politics. That quiet life ended abruptly when her nephew, King William II, died without heirs in 1189. The mainstream fact, her marriage to Henry VI, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, placed her at the center of a storm of competing claims. Rival Norman factions, Sicilian rebels, and foreign invaders all saw her as either a prize or a threat. You step into her audience hall, where the high, painted ceilings filter light onto a mosaic floor. Constance is seated in a tall-backed chair, her robes in the deep green and gold of her house, the embroidery so fine it seems to shift as she moves. Her voice is calm but carries to every corner as she listens to envoys argue over the latest uprisings. There's no mistaking it. She holds herself like a ruler who knows that in Sicily, trust is a currency rarer than gold. Here's your quirky tidbit. When she was heavily pregnant with her only son, the future Frederick II, Constance famously insisted on giving birth publicly in a tent in the town square of Jesse to silence rumors that her child had been smuggled in or swapped. Imagine the medieval gossip mill grinding to a halt because the Queen just turned her labor into a political press conference. Historians still argue whether her reign was primarily about preserving Sicily's autonomy or ensuring the dominance of the Hohenstaufen dynasty through her marriage. Some claim she was a reluctant participant in imperial ambitions, others that she used her imperial connections to secure her own position against a treacherous nobility. Watching her now, it's easy to believe she has her own designs, distinct from both Norman and German agendas. Later in the day, you follow her through the palace gardens. The air is heavy with orange blossom, but her attention is on the horizon, where ships from the mainland are expected. She speaks quietly to a captain about the positioning of the fleet, her tone as precise as any general's. "We greet them as allies," she says, "but we prepare for the other possibility." You can tell the other possibility is always close in her mind. Back inside, a council is convened in a smaller chamber, away from the pomp of the main hall. The room smells faintly of parchment and oil lamps. Constance leans over a map of Sicily, the coastlines inked in fine lines, the inland fortresses marked with small lead weights. She listens as a merchant describes unrest in Messina, then cuts him short with a single raised hand. "We will send grain," she decides, "and a message that we remember who they are loyal to." By nightfall, The palace is lit with hundreds of small lamps. A feast is underway. Musicians playing lutes and drums while dishes of roasted fish and spiced chickpeas are brought to the table. Constance moves among her guests, smiling, laughing lightly at a well-timed jest, but you can see her eyes flicking from group to group, noting who speaks with whom, who leaves early, who seems too quiet. Every interaction is another thread in the web she keeps taut. Much later, long after the feast has ended, you find yourself walking past a balcony where she stands alone, the city sprawled out below. The harbour is dotted with lanterns from anchored ships, their lights swaying gently with the tide. She doesn't turn when she speaks, her voice low but clear in the night air. A crown is not worn, she says. It is held, and if you loosen your grip for even a moment, someone else takes it. In that instant, you understand why Constance has endured, despite the shifting tides of loyalty and the relentless pressure from beyond Sicily's shores. Her strength lies not in overwhelming force, but in her refusal to yield, in her constant vigilance, in the way she turns even vulnerability like the spectacle of her son's birth into a weapon. When you finally leave her side, the city is quiet except for the soft crash of the sea against the harbour walls. Behind you, the Queen remains on her balcony, still watching, still calculating, still holding the crown in her grasp. You can almost feel her eyes on your back until you disappear into the shadowed streets. The midday sun in Jerusalem is relentless, beating down on pale limestone walls that shimmer as if they might dissolve into light. You wind through the narrow streets toward the royal citadel, where the scent of incense from nearby churches mingles with the tang of dust and stone. This is the court of Queen Melisende, ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem during the age of the Crusades, a queen who commands not from behind a curtain, but from the very heart of the political storm. Born in 1105, Melisende was the daughter of King Baldwin II and the Armenian princess Morphia of Melitene. The mainstream fact is this: when Baldwin II died in 1131, Melisende inherited the throne jointly with her husband, Fulk of Anjou. But unlike other co-rulers, she refused to be a silent partner. Over time, she edged Fulk out of real decision-making, earning both admiration and resentment in equal measure. You arrive in her audience hall, the cool shadows broken by shafts of sunlight filtering through narrow windows. Melisende sits on a carved ivory throne, a gold-threaded veil framing her face. She listens to envoys from the Holy Roman Empire, her gaze steady and her posture unyielding. Her voice is low but certain, and every sentence is shaped to remind the listeners that this is her kingdom, not merely a possession of her husband's house. Here's your quirky tidbit. Melisende was a serious patron of the arts, commissioning the lavish Melisende Psalter, a jewel of medieval manuscript illumination. The book was a fusion of Western, Byzantine, and Islamic artistic styles, essentially a visual manifesto that Jerusalem under her reign was both cosmopolitan and under her control. Imagine a ruler today dropping a limited edition coffee table book, except hers doubled as a political statement. Historians still argue whether Melisende's steady consolidation of power was driven by genuine capability or a reaction to being sidelined by Fulk early in their marriage. Some suggest she was naturally suited to rule and merely took her rightful place. Others see her as a shrewd opportunist who capitalized on her husband's missteps. Watching her now, you suspect the truth is both she had the skill and the will, and the opportunity simply accelerated what was inevitable. Later, you follow her into the palace gardens, where olive trees cast pockets of shade on the tiled paths. She walks slowly, speaking in a measured tone to a bishop about trade with the Italian maritime republics. The conversation shifts seamlessly from theology to tariffs, her mind as comfortable with scripture as it is with silver. A young scribe hurries behind, jotting every word. You realize she's not just conversing, she's issuing policy. In the afternoon, she convenes a smaller council in a chamber lined with hanging oil lamps. Maps of the Levant cover the walls, and carved wooden chess pieces stand in formation on a large table, except these are not merely for play. Each piece corresponds to an actual garrison or ally, and Melisenda moves them with the ease of someone who knows both the game and the ground. A messenger arrives with troubling news. A fortress near the border has changed hands. She pauses only a moment before assigning new troops, rerouting supplies, and dispatching a trusted commander to take control. Her voice never rises. The room simply bends to her decision. That evening the royal chapel fills with the sound of chanting. Melisenda kneels in the front row, head bowed, but even here she commands the space. Her piety is genuine, yet she uses it as deftly as she wields her political power. The priests speak of humility, but everyone knows she has the final say in the appointment of bishops and the allocation of church lands. Later, as the city quiets under a wash of stars, you find her alone in the scriptorium. She is turning the pages of an illuminated manuscript, the gold leaf catching the lamplight. Without looking up, she says, "A king may have a crown, a queen must have a kingdom. The distinction is not lost on you. For Melisende, the crown is merely a symbol. The true power lies in the network of alliances, the flow of trade, the loyalty of her commanders, and the subtle art of making every faction believe they are her favorite. When you leave her presence, the streets of Jerusalem feel different, less like a holy city in a perpetual state of siege, and more like the center of a carefully balanced empire. You realize her reign is not just about surviving the Crusader state's constant threats. It's about proving, day after day, that in a land claimed by so many, it is she who holds the reins. And as long as Melisenda sits on that throne, the kingdom will bend to her will, no matter who wears the armor outside its gates. Paris in winter smells of wood smoke and damp wool, and today the streets are crowded with merchants shouting prices over the clatter of cartwheels. But in the heart of the Palais de la Cité, a very different sort of noise reigns quiet, deliberate, and utterly controlled. Here, Blanche of Castile holds court. Born in 1188, granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, she became Queen of France as the wife of Louis VIII. But her true trial came after his death in 1226, when she assumed the regency for their 12-year-old son, Louis IX. The mainstream fact: Blanche ruled France in her son's name for over a decade, navigating rebellions, foreign threats, and political intrigue, while also shaping Louis into the king and later saint he would become. She was no placeholder. She was the power. You enter the great hall to find her seated beneath a canopy, embroidered with fleur-de-lis. Her gown is simple but elegant, her hair hidden beneath a fine white veil. Blanche's voice is calm, as she listens to a provincial noble complain about unfair taxes. She asks 3 precise questions, and by the time the man finishes answering, his complaint has twisted into an admission that he owes the crown more than he thought. Here's your quirky tidbit. Blanche had an almost theatrical way of enforcing loyalty. Chroniclers tell of her once refusing to let a powerful lord leave her presence until he swore an oath of allegiance, physically blocking his way until he complied. It was less brute force, and more the unshakable will of a mother who could make even grown men feel like scolded children. Historians still argue whether her regency was defined more by her diplomatic skill or by her iron-fisted control over the nobility. Some view her as a master negotiator, keeping France stable during a vulnerable transition. Others see her as a centralizer who brooked no opposition. Watching her now, you suspect both are true. She is polite when it suits her, implacable when it doesn't. Later, you accompany her into a smaller council chamber. The table is covered with correspondence from across France, reports from sheriffs, letters from bishops, and requests from merchants. She moves through them swiftly, marking some with a small cross, others with a neat fold to be revisited. When a scribe hesitates over her instructions, she fixes him with a single look that removes all need for clarification. In the afternoon, the Queen visits the cathedral. The bells toll as she enters, her retinue parting the crowd without a word. She kneels at the altar, her lips moving in silent prayer, but you notice her eyes scanning the congregation. Faith is part of her life, yes, but so is intelligence gathering. She sees which noble families attend, which absences might signal trouble, and who whispers with whom in the shadows. That evening the court gathers for a banquet. Blanche sits between her son and a visiting ambassador from England. She speaks to each in turn, weaving compliments and subtle challenges into the same conversation. The ambassador leaves smiling, perhaps not realizing he has agreed to terms slightly more favorable to France than he intended. When the hall begins to thin, she draws her young son aside. Her voice softens, but her words are deliberate. She tells him that a king must be loved, but also feared, that mercy must never replace judgment, and that piety without strength is an invitation to ruin. Louis listens intently, absorbing lessons that will outlive her regency. Later, you pass her private chamber and glimpse her alone by the fire, reading a letter in Latin. She makes a small note in the margin before sealing it again, the wax stamped with her own device rather than the royal crest. Whatever it contains, it is a matter for her alone. You realize then that Blanche's true danger is her ability to combine maternal warmth with political ruthlessness. To an enemy, she might seem approachable until they discover too late that the hand offering comfort is also guiding the blade. She doesn't need to shout or threaten. Her authority is woven into every glance, every word, every expectation she sets. As you step out into the cold Paris night, the towers of Notre Dame silhouetted against the moon, you understand why no rebellion succeeded under her watch. Blanche of Castile doesn't just protect the throne, she becomes it, wrapping herself so tightly around the crown that to remove her would be to destroy the kingdom itself. And for more than a decade, that is exactly how she intends to rule. The streets of Naples hum with noise merchants calling out the ripeness of figs, fishermen hauling nets still dripping from the bay, the chatter of dialects from every corner of the Mediterranean. But inside the Castel Nuovo, the air is different. Here, the laughter is careful, the smiles measured, and every word feels like it's passing through a sieve before reaching the throne. At the center sits Queen Joanna I of Naples, a ruler whose life is a tangle of opulence, scandal, and survival. Born in 1326, Joanna inherited the throne at just 16, a young queen in a kingdom that prized her beauty almost as much as her political value. The mainstream fact is this: her reign was marred by a notorious scandal, the 1345 murder of her first husband, Anjou of Hungary, a crime for which she was widely suspected but never convicted. Whether guilty or not, the suspicion clung to her like expensive perfume. You step into the audience chamber where Joanna sits in a carved walnut chair, a tapestry of hunting scenes draped behind her. The light from tall windows catches on the pearls woven into her hair. A delegation from Provence kneels before her, presenting petitions. She hears them patiently, her voice soft but decisive, never revealing more than she intends. The courtiers stand at a respectful distance, their expressions frozen masks that reveal nothing except perhaps to Joanna, who sees everything. Here's your quirky tidbit. Joanna was once tried for her husband's murder not in a secret chamber, but before the Pope himself in Avignon. She arrived, dressed in black, argued her own case in flawless rhetoric, and left with her crown intact. It was less like a royal deposition and more like a medieval legal drama, with the Queen playing both defendant and star witness. Historians still argue whether Joanna was an innocent caught in a web of dynastic rivalries or a calculating survivor who removed obstacles as needed. Some depict her as a patron of culture and a champion of justice, others as a monarch who wrapped her ambitions in silk and gold. Standing here now, you can't decide which version is more dangerous. Later, you accompany her to a small council chamber overlooking the harbour. Ships bob below, their sails bright against the blue water. Joanna leans over a map marked with red wax seals, ports loyal to her, ports in rebellion, and ports under watch. She asks her admirals about the Genoese fleet, her tone light but the questions pointed. When one of them hesitates, she turns her gaze on him, and you can almost hear the temperature drop. In the afternoon, she walks through the palace gardens, her ladies-in-waiting trailing behind like petals scattered on the wind. She pauses to admire the orange trees, but her real attention is on a pair of nobles whispering near the fountain. Without raising her voice, she calls them over and engages them in casual conversation, skillfully extracting enough from their nervous answers to confirm her suspicions about their loyalties. That evening, the banquet hall glows with candlelight. Musicians play the lute and viol. Servants carry trays of roast capon and sweet pastries, and the air is thick with the scent of cinnamon and wine. Joanna moves among her guests, offering gracious smiles and light touches on the arm. But you notice she never lingers too long with anyone long enough to charm, short enough to avoid giving away her true thoughts. After the feast, a messenger arrives with a sealed letter. Joanna reads it quickly, then folds it and slips it into the bodice of her gown without a word. Her composure never cracks, though you think you catch the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Later still, you pass her private chapel, where she kneels alone before a gilded altar. The flickering candlelight makes her face seem almost ethereal, yet you can't help but remember that this serene figure is the same woman who faced down papal judgment and walked away unscathed. You leave the palace with the sound of the sea in your ears and the image of Joanna in your mind, a queen as comfortable in the role of devout widow as in that of political strategist. Her danger lies in the fact that you can never quite be sure which role she's playing at any given moment. And in Naples, that uncertainty is enough to keep everyone guessing and afraid. The air in London this morning carries the damp chill of the Thames, but inside Westminster Hall, a quiet buzz of anticipation fills the space. Merchants, nobles, and clerics mingle beneath the vaulted timber roof, their voices echoing off stone. You move toward the dais at the far end, where Queen Philippa of Hainaut sits not draped in aloof majesty, but leaning forward, speaking easily with a group of aldermen, as though she were a trusted neighbour rather than the Queen of England. Born in 1310 Hainaut, Philippa came to England as the wife of Edward III. The mainstream fact. She was renowned for her diplomacy and her role in softening some of Edward's harsher impulses, most famously persuading him to spare the lives of the burghers of Calais after the city's surrender in 1347. Yet her influence extended far beyond that single act of mercy. She helped manage England's wartime economy, advised the king on foreign alliances, and served as regent while he campaigned abroad. You watch her now as she listens to petitions from London's merchants. One man, voice trembling, explains that a new royal levy will ruin his business. Philippa tilts her head, asks a few precise questions, and then offers a compromise that will both satisfy the crown's coffers and keep the trade flowing. She does it without theatrics, as if solving problems is as natural as breathing. Here's your quirky tidbit. During one of Edward's campaigns, Philippa accompanied him to the battlefield not as a warrior, but as a visible figure of stability. Chroniclers recorded her overseeing supplies and morale, riding along the lines in a modest gown rather than armour, yet earning the respect of soldiers who recognized her presence as a promise that England's royal house stood with them. It's hard to picture a modern head of state doing the equivalent without a full security cordon and press team. Historians still argue whether her political power came from Edward's genuine respect for her judgment or from her ability to operate subtly in the background. Some say she was the rare medieval queen who held influence without provoking backlash. Others suggest she carefully hid the full extent of her authority behind a public image of gentleness. Watching her now, it's clear she knows exactly how she's perceived and she uses it. In the afternoon, you follow her to a council meeting in the Painted Chamber. The walls are alive with murals of biblical kings, their bright colours fading but still regal. Philippa sits at the table beside the king, but when a discussion over a disputed border turns tense, Edward leans back slightly, allowing her to speak. Her tone is even, her reasoning clear, and within minutes she has diffused the quarrel without conceding ground. The lords leave looking satisfied, though none have actually gotten what they came for. Later, she walks the palace gardens with a small entourage. She stops often to speak with gardeners, servants, and guards, greeting them by name. It's not just charm, it's intelligence gathering. By maintaining ties with those at every level of court life, She ensures she hears about trouble before it festers into rebellion. That evening, Westminster hosts a feast in honor of a visiting delegation from Flanders. The tables groan under roasted venison, trenchers of bread, and flagons of ale. Philippa moves between English and Flemish with ease, drawing laughter from one side of the table and thoughtful nods from the other. When the conversation turns to trade agreements, she steers it toward mutual benefit without ever making it sound like negotiation. As the feast draws to a close, a herald announces news from the North Scottish raids along the border. Edward's brow furrows, but Philippa leans in, murmuring a few words. Whatever she says is enough to ease his frown, and he nods to her before calling for the council to reconvene in the morning. Later, as the halls grow quiet, you see her in a small chapel, kneeling before the altar. Her face is serene, but her clasped hands are steady, her back straight. This is not the fragile piety of someone retreating from the world, it's the composure of a woman who knows that mercy and power are not opposites, but allies. You leave Westminster with the image of Philippa's calm smile lingering in your mind. Her danger lies in the way she makes power look effortless, hiding the complexity of her influence behind a veil of compassion. In a court where survival often depends on intimidation or fear, Philippa of Hainaut thrives by convincing everyone she is only here to help, while quietly ensuring that she is always, unmistakably, in control. The narrow streets of Paris are restless tonight. Torches flicker against damp stone, and the shadows seem to cling longer than they should. You pass under the carved arches of the Louvre's old fortress, into a court where whispers are currency, and survival depends on knowing when to smile and when to strike. At the centre of it all stands Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort of France, mother to 3 kings, and a woman whose name will forever be entangled with the most infamous bloodletting in French history. Born in Florence in 1519, Catherine married Henry II of France and entered a court already bristling with factions. The mainstream fact: after Henry's death in 1559, she became regent for her son Charles IX, wielding power in one of the most turbulent periods of French history, the Wars of Religion. She is remembered fairly or not for her suspected role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were killed in Paris and across France. You find her in a long gallery, walking slowly between towering windows, her skirts whispering over the polished floor. She pauses to study a tapestry of a hunt, though her thoughts are clearly elsewhere. Courtiers follow at a careful distance, unsure whether proximity means favour or danger today. Catherine turns to you with a polite nod, her eyes as unreadable as black marble. Here's your quirky tidbit. Catherine had a fascination with astrology, and often consulted the famed seer Nostradamus. Some at court mocked her for it, but she used those predictions as both personal reassurance and political theatre. An ominous forecast, whispered at the right moment, could nudge a hesitant ally into taking her side or frighten an opponent into backing down. Historians still argue whether her legacy is one of pragmatic governance in impossible circumstances or ruthless self-preservation at any cost. Some defend her as a moderating force between Catholic and Protestant extremes. Others insist she fanned the flames when it suited her, letting chaos weaken those who might threaten her children's reigns. Watching her now, you sense she doesn't care which story history tells, as long as it agrees she was never irrelevant. In the council chamber, she sits at the head of the table despite her son technically being king. The discussion turns to the latest uprisings in the provinces. Catherine listens, her hands folded, her face giving nothing away. When she speaks, her voice is quiet but cuts through the room. She outlines a plan that offers both concessions and punishments, leaving each faction believing they've gained more than they actually have. Later, she invites a few trusted advisors to her private apartments. The room is warm with the glow of many candles, the air thick with the scent of rose oil. She pours wine herself, a gesture that lowers her guests' guard, and listens as they speak more freely than they might in public. Every so often, she asks a pointed question that seems casual, until you realize she's just extracted another piece of the puzzle she's assembling in her mind. That night, a lavish masque is held in the great hall. Nobles swirl in elaborate costumes, laughter rising above the music. Catherine moves among them like a chess master studying the board, exchanging pleasantries, noting alliances, and letting the masks do her work for her people will say more when they think they're hidden. When she finally sits, it's beside an influential duke she's been courting for weeks. By the end of the evening, his support is hers, though he may not realize it yet. In the quiet hours after midnight, you find her alone in her library, a single candle burning beside an open ledger. It's not a book of philosophy or prayer, but a ledger of debts, favors, and obligations, her true record of the realm. She glances at you and smiles faintly. "People remember victories," she says. "I remember who owes me." You leave the Louvre with the faint sound of the masque's music still in the air. The streets outside are dark, the torches nearly burned down. Somewhere in the upper chambers, Catherine de' Medici is still awake, plotting how to keep her family on the throne another day, another year, another generation if she can manage it. Her danger is not in sudden open strikes, it is in the long game. The patient weaving of threads so tight that by the time her rivals see the trap, they've been in it for years. The streets of Rennes are wet from a passing rain, their slick cobblestones reflecting the pale light of a winter morning. You make your way to the ducal palace, its towers rising over the clustered rooftops of Brittany. Inside, the corridors smell faintly of beeswax polish and wood smoke, and the soft echo of footsteps leads you toward a woman who has spent her entire life defending her homeland from being swallowed whole. This is Anne of Brittany, twice crowned Queen of France, Duchess in her own right, and a master at turning marriage into a shield. Born in 1477, Anne inherited the Duchy of Brittany at just 11 years old after her father's death. The mainstream fact: she fiercely resisted French attempts to annex her duchy, marrying first to Maximilian of Austria in a controversial proxy wedding, then after France invaded marrying King Charles VIII of France in 1491. When Charles died, she married his cousin and successor, Louis XII, becoming queen consort twice and ensuring Brittany retained its autonomy for as long as possible. You find her in the Great Hall, seated beneath a canopy, embroidered with the ermine spots of Brittany. She is speaking with a delegation from Nantes, her voice calm, her Breton accent unmistakable. While her words are courteous, every phrase is weighted, reminding them and anyone listening that she is Duchess first, Queen second. The French courtiers nearby shift uncomfortably at the subtle defiance, but none dare interrupt. Here's your quirky tidbit. Anne was one of the earliest European royals to adopt the sunflower as a personal emblem. In her court, the flower was not merely decorative, it symbolized loyalty to Brittany, always turning toward the light of its duchess. Her tapestries and manuscripts are dotted with the motif, a constant reminder that even in the gilded halls of France, her roots lay elsewhere. Historians still argue whether her dual queenships were acts of political capitulation or strategic triumph. Some see her as a victim of French expansionism, forced into unions that gradually eroded Brittany's independence. Others view her as a pragmatist who used her position to safeguard her duchy's rights far longer than anyone thought possible. Watching her now, you suspect the truth lies in her ability to accept the necessary marriage while never surrendering the cause. Later in the day, she walks with you through the palace gardens, the rain-washed air carrying the scent of rosemary and damp earth. She gestures toward a bed of flowers, explaining in a low voice how each plant has its meaning in courtly language. Violets for modesty, lilies for purity, rosemary for remembrance. It's a charming lesson, but you sense the deeper point. Anne knows that symbols are tools, and she wields them as carefully as any blade. In the afternoon, she meets with a group of Breton merchants in a smaller chamber. The walls are hung with maps of the duchy's ports and trade routes. Anne listens to their concerns about new French tariffs, then proposes a workaround so deftly that it feels like a shared victory rather than an act of quiet rebellion. The merchants leave smiling, their loyalty to her deepened yet again. That evening, the court assembles for a formal dinner. The French nobles sit on one side of the long table, the Bretons on the other, a visible line down the middle of the hall. Anne moves between both groups, speaking in flawless French to one, warm Breton to the other, switching so effortlessly that the entire evening feels balanced, though you can tell her heart beats more quickly when she returns to her own countrymen. As the meal winds down, a minstrel sings in Breton, his voice carrying a tune older than the union of duchy and crown. Anne listens intently, her expression softening, though her fingers tap in time with the rhythm, a signal perhaps that she is keeping count of every measure in this political dance. Later, long after the hall has emptied, you find her in her private study. The room smells of parchment and ink, and the desk is covered in correspondence letters to Breton nobles, to foreign allies, to the Pope himself. She seals each with her ducal arms, not the French fleur-de-lis. When she looks up, her eyes are clear, steady. "They think the crown has me," she says quietly, "but it is Brittany I serve." You leave the palace with the sound of the rain starting again, the gutters rushing with water. Behind you, Anne of Brittany is still awake, still writing, still plotting how to keep her duchy free in spirit if not entirely in law. Her danger is not in armies or sieges, it is in the way she turns the most personal of bonds, marriage itself, into an instrument of statecraft. And as long as she draws breath, Brittany will never belong wholly to France. The late summer sun glints off the towers of Wawel Castle, its pale walls rising above the Vistula River like a watchful sentinel. The air smells faintly of warm stone and blooming linden trees as you climb the steps to the throne room. Here, in the heart of Krakow, the mood is purposeful rather than ostentatious, exactly as Queen Jadwiga of Poland prefers it. Born around 1373 or 1374, Jadwiga became Queen Regnant of Poland at just 10 years old, crowned king rather than queen in 1384 to emphasize her authority as the sovereign in her own right. The mainstream fact, her marriage to Jogaila, Grand Duke of Lithuania, in 1386 created a powerful union between Poland and Lithuania, transforming the political map of Eastern Europe. Though young, she quickly proved herself a ruler capable of balancing war, diplomacy, and religious reform. When you enter the hall, she is seated on a high-backed chair carved with intricate vines, wearing a simple gown of crimson wool edged with fur. Her crown is modest compared to the heavy golden circlets of other monarchs, yet it suits her practical, unpretentious, but undeniable. She listens to a dispute between two merchants from Gdańsk, her hands folded on her lap. After a moment's thought, she offers a judgment that not only settles their quarrel but secures an agreement that benefits the crown. Here's your quirky tidbit. Jadwiga was a devout Catholic and is remembered for personally funding the restoration of the University of Krakow. She reportedly pawned her royal jewels to raise the money, a gesture that both enhanced her reputation for piety and strengthened the intellectual power of her kingdom. Imagine a modern head of state selling off their luxury cars to fund scholarships. It was that rare and that bold. Historians still argue whether Jadwiga's greatest achievement was the political alliance with Lithuania or her role in promoting Christianity among Lithuania's pagan population. Some say her marriage was an act of calculated statecraft that secured Poland's borders. Others argue she used it as a way to spread her faith and influence beyond her kingdom's frontiers. Standing here, you get the impression that she saw no conflict between the two. Later, you follow her into the castle gardens, where medicinal herbs grow in neat rows. She bends to pluck a sprig of sage, explaining its use for fevers. The knowledge is genuine. She learned it from the nuns who helped educate her, and it's easy to see why her people revere her as a ruler who cares for their well-being beyond taxes and law. In the afternoon, she meets with her council in a chamber hung with maps of the Polish frontier. Her tone is firm but patient as she listens to a report on Teutonic knights moving near the border. "We will answer with envoys first," she decides, "and soldiers only if they give us no choice." The council murmurs approval, but you notice she already has both letters and troop movements prepared. Peace for Jadwiga, is not naivety, it's simply the preferable opening move. That evening, a liturgy is held in the cathedral. Jadwiga kneels in the front pew, her hands clasped, the candlelight gilding her profile. Even here, you can sense her presence shaping the room. The priests are more careful with their words, the congregation more attentive. Her faith is not for display, it is woven into her rule, a constant source of legitimacy and purpose. Afterward, she walks through the cloisters with a young scribe, discussing the progress of a manuscript being copied for the university. Her questions are detailed: what kind of ink, how many pages completed, and when the scribe hesitates, she promises to send better parchment from her own stores. The gesture is small, but it is the kind of personal involvement that cements loyalty. Later still, you pass her private chapel and see her writing by the flickering light of a single lamp. The parchment before her is a letter to a foreign ruler, carefully phrased to mix warmth with subtle pressure. She pauses to seal it, then sits for a long moment staring at the flame, as if weighing something too heavy to say aloud. You leave Wawel Castle with the knowledge that Jadwiga's danger lies not in open aggression, but in the way she combines moral authority with political acumen. She can disarm an enemy with kindness, or bind an ally with principle, and both feel genuine because they are. In her court, faith and strategy are two edges of the same blade, and she wields them with the same steady hand. The wind in Westminster today carries the damp scent of the Thames and the faint toll of church bells. You weave through the echoing stone corridors of the Palace of Westminster until you find yourself at the threshold of a chamber that feels more like a war room than a royal audience. This is the domain of Margaret of Anjou, a queen who did not come to England to play the part of a decorative consort. She came to fight. Born in 1430 Lorraine, Margaret married Henry VI of England in 1445. The mainstream fact: during the Wars of the Roses, she became the driving force behind the Lancastrian cause, leading armies, rallying supporters, and fiercely defending her husband's crown against the Yorkist faction. In an age when queens were expected to stand behind their kings, Margaret often stood in front. When you enter, she is hunched over a map spread across a heavy oak table, the candlelight picking out the lines of fortresses and rivers. A captain points to Yorkist movements in the north, but Margaret interrupts, her voice sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. She demands updates on troop numbers, supply lines, and loyalty pledges from key lords. There's no deference in her tone, this is her war, and everyone in the room knows it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Margaret was once called the most manlike, valiant creature by one of her enemies. It was meant as an insult, but she wore it like armor. She even took the field in armor herself, riding among her troops to be seen as their leader. Imagine the shock in a 15th century army camp, when the commander rallying them was a queen with her banner flying beside the king's. Historians still argue whether Margaret's aggressiveness prolonged the conflict or was the only thing keeping the Lancastrian cause alive. Some see her as a reckless instigator who could not accept political compromise. Others paint her as a necessary force of will in the face of a passive, often incapacitated husband. Watching her now, it's clear that her energy is not the polite persistence of diplomacy. It's the relentless momentum of someone who refuses to back down even when the odds are against her. In the afternoon, you follow her to a council meeting where a few noblemen, perhaps emboldened by wine or rank, attempt to question her strategy. Margaret fixes them with a glare that would freeze molten iron. She doesn't raise her voice, she doesn't need to. She lays out her reasoning in such detail that their objections collapse under the weight of her logic. By the time she's finished, the doubters are nodding along, perhaps even convinced they had supported her plan all along. Later, she walks through the palace gardens, the early spring air cool on her face. Her ladies follow at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves. Margaret stops to speak with a gardener trimming the hedges. Her questions are gentle, even warm, but you realize she is also gauging the mood of the common people. Loyalty is not just won on the battlefield, but in the kitchens and courtyards. By evening, the great hall is filled with the glow of torches and the sound of clattering dishes. Margaret sits at the high table, speaking with a messenger fresh from the north. His report is grim. Yorkist forces are gathering strength, but she smiles faintly, as if bad news is simply another challenge to be solved. She asks him to eat and drink before sending him back with fresh orders, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who expects her will to be obeyed. Late at night, long after most of the court has gone to bed, you find her alone in a small chamber, writing letters by the light of a single candle. The wax seal beside her bears the Lancastrian rose, its red petals vivid against the dim glow. Her writing is swift and sure, the strokes of someone who has repeated her cause so often she could write it in her sleep. As you leave her presence, the corridors feel colder, the air heavier. Margaret of Anjou's danger lies not only in her strategic mind, but in her sheer refusal to accept defeat. She will fight with pen, word, and sword until the last banner falls, and even then, you suspect, she would find a way to raise it again. The streets of Granada are alive with the mingled scents of orange blossoms and spice, but in the royal court of Castile, the air is heavier, thicker with the gravity of decisions that will shape the known world. Isabella I of Castile sits at the centre of it all, her presence as steady as the stone walls surrounding her. This is not a woman who rules by accident. Born in 1451, Isabella became Queen of Castile in 1474 after a contested succession. The mainstream fact: together with her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon, she unified Spain, completed the Reconquista by taking Granada in 1492, and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. Her reign is one of the most pivotal in European history, a turning point that launched Spain into global power. When you enter her audience chamber, the floor is patterned with tiles in Moorish designs, a reminder of the kingdom's recent conquest. Isabella sits at a long table covered in parchment, each document marked with her distinctive monogram. She listens to a Genoese navigator explain his proposal for a westward voyage to reach the Indies. Her questions are sharp, focused not on dreams but on logistics. How much will it cost? What route will he take? What will be the return? Columbus answers eagerly, but she doesn't commit. Not yet. Isabella does not gamble without reason. Here's your quirky tidbit. Isabella was known to travel with her own personal scriptorium. Wherever she went, whether on campaign or progress, she carried scribes, parchment, seals, and a portable desk, ensuring she could govern from anywhere. Imagine a modern leader bringing a mobile office into the middle of a war zone, still signing decrees between military briefings. Historians still argue whether Isabella's legacy should be celebrated for unifying Spain and expanding its influence, or criticized for policies like the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from her kingdoms. Some see her as a visionary ruler, others as the architect of religious intolerance. Standing in her court now, you can feel both truths pressing against each other: her reign, a blend of calculated vision and unyielding faith. Later, you accompany her to a meeting with military commanders. A large map of Iberia lies across the table, marked with the positions of remaining Nasrid forces. Isabella asks for updates on supply lines, siege progress, and morale. She nods as reports come in, occasionally interrupting to clarify a point or suggest an alternative route. Her tone is authoritative without being overbearing. She knows her commanders respect her because she earns it with preparation and decisiveness. In the afternoon, she walks in the gardens, her ladies trailing behind at a respectful distance. She pauses to pick a sprig of rosemary, turning it between her fingers as she speaks to you in a low voice about the future. "We will be remembered," she says, "but we must choose for what." There is no vanity in her tone, only certainty. By evening, the court gathers for a feast in honor of a diplomatic delegation from Portugal. The tables groan under platters of roasted game, figs, and honey cakes. Isabella moves from guest to guest, conversing in Castilian, Latin, and Portuguese as easily as if each were her native tongue. She is gracious, but every interaction is calculated. Every smile, every question, every toast is an act of statecraft. Later, after the feast, she returns to her private chambers, where a small fire burns low. A servant brings her a leather-bound book, and she spends an hour reading by candlelight, the flicker of the flame dancing over her steady features. She closes it, dips her pen in ink, and begins drafting a letter to Ferdinand about the state of negotiations with Columbus. As you leave her that night, you realize that Isabella's danger lies in her ability to combine unshakable conviction with relentless pragmatism. She does not just dream of empires, she builds the foundations stone by stone, policy by policy, until what seemed impossible stands solid before her. In her court, ambition is not a vice, it is the air everyone breathes, and she ensures there is only one source for that air: herself. The air in Buda is crisp this morning, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint metallic tang of the Danube. You cross a stone courtyard toward the royal palace, its towers rising pale against the winter sky. Inside, the halls are warm but hushed, the quiet broken only by the murmur of servants and the soft rustle of silk skirts. This is the court of Beatrice of Hungary, queen consort, political strategist, and a woman who turned the seemingly passive role of royal bride into a seat of real influence. Born in 1457 Naples, Beatrice was the daughter of Ferdinand I of Naples and married King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary in 1476. The mainstream fact, though her marriage was childless, she positioned herself at the center of court politics, acting as a diplomat, cultural patron, and, later, a skilled negotiator in the scramble for influence after Matthias's death in 1490. She navigated shifting alliances with a composure that made rivals underestimate her until they realized too late that she had already secured her advantage. When you enter the audience hall, Beatrice is seated beneath a painted coffered ceiling, a fur-lined mantle draped over her shoulders. Before her stand two envoys, one from Venice, the other from the Holy Roman Empire, each eager to secure Hungary's favor. She listens to them in turn, switching between Italian and Latin with ease, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make each man believe she favors his cause. You can see in her eyes, though, that she's already decided how to use them both. Here's your quirky tidbit. Beatrice was so devoted to courtly learning that she brought Italian humanist scholars to Buda, turning the Hungarian court into a Renaissance hub. Chroniclers note that she sometimes invited these scholars to dine with her, quizzing them on philosophy and history, while subtly drawing political information from their travels. Imagine a dinner party where half the conversation is Plato, and the other half is state intelligence. Historians still argue whether Beatrice's influence after Matthias's death was born from genuine political acumen or simply from her network of allies. Some suggest she overplayed her hand, marrying the next king, Vladislav II, only to have the marriage annulled when the alliance no longer suited him. Others believe she managed an almost impossible feat, retaining dignity and leverage, even when stripped of official power. In the afternoon, you accompany her to a private council in a smaller chamber hung with tapestries from Florence. A table is laid out with parchment maps of the Hungarian frontier, markers indicating troop positions, and lists of fortress supplies. Though she is not a commander, Beatrice asks pointed questions about garrisons and winter provisions, her tone calm but leaving no room for evasive answers. The generals in the room respond with the respect of men who know she is speaking for the crown as much as for herself. Later, she walks the palace gardens, the bare branches of winter trees casting long shadows over the snow. Her ladies trail behind, but she stops now and then to speak privately to a courtier or a visiting merchant. Each exchange is brief, but the merchant leaves looking pleased, the courtier thoughtful. It's a reminder that not all statecraft happens in throne rooms. That evening a feast is held in the great hall. Musicians play lutes and rebecks while servants bring in roasted venison, warm bread, and sweetmeats from Italy. Beatrice sits at the high table, speaking quietly with a visiting Polish diplomat. At one point, she leans in, her voice low enough that only he can hear, and whatever she says makes him pause mid-bite, then nod slowly. She leans back, smiling faintly, and turns her attention to the next guest as if nothing important has passed between them. Later, In her private apartments, she reviews correspondence with her secretary. Letters from Naples, Vienna, and even Constantinople are stacked in neat piles, each bearing her annotations in a fine, precise hand. She dictates replies in 3 languages without hesitation, weaving formality with subtle hints of intent. As you leave her for the night, you realize Beatrice's danger lies in her ability to operate in the spaces between official acts where decisions are shaped not by decree, but by whispered promises, casual remarks, and the quiet persistence of a queen who knows that influence doesn't always require a crown. In a world where power is often measured in armies, she reminds you that it can also be measured in the pause after a carefully chosen word. The mist clings low over the northern Italian plains, turning the road to Pavia into a pale ribbon stretching toward the horizon. You arrive at the royal residence just as the bells of the cathedral toll, their sound deep and resonant in the morning air. Inside, the corridors are wide but dim, lit by high windows and the flicker of oil lamps. This is the domain of Adelaide of Italy, a queen and empress whose political reach stretched across the Holy Roman Empire, and whose will could match any monarch of her age. Born in 931, Adelaide was the daughter of King Rudolph II of Burgundy. The mainstream fact: she became Queen of Italy at 16, widow at 18, prisoner shortly after, and then, through a daring escape, a central figure in the politics of both Italy and Germany. Her marriage to Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor, cemented her influence across Europe, and she later served as regent for her grandson Otto III. Few rulers, male or female, navigated so many shifting thrones and crowns with such relentless determination. When you enter her receiving chamber, Adelaide sits at a heavy oak table, her posture straight despite her years. Before her are petitions from Lombard nobles, trade agreements with German merchants, and correspondence from monasteries seeking her patronage. She reads each in turn, her eyes sharp beneath a thin silver circlet. It is clear she has no patience for empty flattery. Her interest is in loyalty, results, and the stability of the realm. Here's your quirky tidbit. Adelaide's escape from captivity in the fortress of Garda was so dramatic it became the stuff of legend. Disguised and aided by a loyal priest, she fled through a postern gate at night, traveling across Lake Garda in a small boat before finding refuge with allies. Imagine a medieval queen pulling off the kind of jailbreak that would make an action film director proud. Historians still argue whether Adelaide's greatest strength was her political skill or her ability to leverage her piety for influence. Some believe her generosity to the church was purely strategic, ensuring that bishops and abbots supported her authority. Others see her as a sincerely devout woman, whose charity was genuine, but whose faith never blinded her to political realities. Watching her now, you suspect she managed to be both at once. Later in the day, you follow her into a council with imperial envoys. The topic is the governance of Italian territories under the empire's control. A German noble speaks at length about the need for firmer oversight, implying that local rulers cannot be trusted. Adelaide listens without interrupting, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. When he finishes, she calmly points out the value of local loyalty, noting that harsh governance breeds rebellion. She offers a compromise that protects imperial interests without alienating Italian lords, a solution no one else in the room seems capable of crafting. In the afternoon, she visits the convent she founded just outside the city walls. The nuns greet her with warmth, and Adelaide walks among the cloisters with the abbess, discussing not only religious matters, but also the convent's role as a centre of literacy and health care. It is a reminder that for her, the church is both a spiritual anchor and a political tool. That evening, a small banquet is held in her honour. The tables are set with roasted fowl, fresh bread, and wine from the vineyards along the Po. Adelaide moves among her guests, speaking in the soft, measured tones of someone who knows that influence is built in conversation as much as in the throne room. She asks after their families, their lands, their concerns, each exchange a thread in a web she has been weaving for decades. Later still, In her private chamber, she sits beside the fire, dictating a letter to her secretary. Her words are precise, the tone both formal and warm, and you realize this letter, ostensibly a note of thanks, also contains subtle instructions that will shift the balance of power in a distant province. As you step out into the night air, the bells toll again, their sound carrying over the misty fields. Adelaide of Italy remains inside, still working, still plotting. Her danger lies not in sudden coups or open warfare, but in the enduring patience of a ruler who knows that the strongest empires are built as much on persuasion as on force, and that she has mastered both. The harbour of Stockholm is frozen over, a sheet of pale glass reflecting a sun too weak to melt it. Wind cuts across the water like a blade, rattling the rigging of ships moored in the ice. You follow a procession of fur-clad courtiers into the royal palace, where the air is warmer but carries the same undercurrent of tension. This is the court of Christina, of Sweden, queen regnant, scholar, patron of the arts, and one of the most unpredictable rulers of her time. Born in 1626, Christina was the daughter of King Gustavus Adolphus, the famed warrior king who died in battle when she was just 6. The mainstream fact: she inherited the throne in 1632 and reigned until 1654, when she abdicated under circumstances that stunned Europe. Her reign was marked by intellectual ambition, lavish patronage, and political decisions that kept her advisors guessing. When you enter the audience chamber, Christina is pacing, her hands clasped behind her back. She wears no crown today, only a plain velvet gown, but the way the courtiers track her movements makes it clear she needs no regalia to command attention. A philosopher visiting from France is presenting an argument about statecraft, and she interrupts with a counterpoint so sharp it leaves the poor man blinking. Christina doesn't simply listen, she tests, challenges, provokes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Christina was known for her unconventional habits, including wearing men's clothing at times and refusing to marry despite immense pressure to produce an heir. She once remarked that she had no inclination for the married state, a statement that rattled every court that tried to pair her with their eligible princes. Imagine the 17th century equivalent of a monarch politely telling all of Europe to stop sending marriage proposals. Historians still argue whether her abdication was the culmination of a personal crisis, a spiritual journey, or a calculated escape from political constraints. Some believe her conversion to Catholicism, announced soon after she relinquished the throne, was planned long in advance. Others think it was a sudden decision, driven by disillusionment with Protestant Sweden. Standing here, you get the sense she always knew she would leave, and spent her reign shaping the stage for her exit. Later in the day, you follow her to the library, where sunlight filters through tall windows onto shelves crammed with books in Latin, Greek, and several modern languages. Christina moves through them like a hostess showing off her prized wine cellar, pulling volumes at random and quoting passages from memory. A courtier timidly reminds her of a pending council meeting, but she waves him off. Ideas, to her, are as urgent as state affairs. When she finally attends the council, she takes her seat at the head of the table and listens to a debate on Sweden's military commitments in Germany. Her advisors urge caution. Christina leans forward, challenging their pessimism and pointing out opportunities they've overlooked. She is persuasive, not through volume but through sheer force of logic and unexpected angles. By the end of the discussion, she has shifted the consensus entirely. That evening, the palace hosts a salon in her honor. Musicians play madrigals, poets recite verses, and scholars debate under her amused gaze. Christina circulates, sometimes tossing a teasing remark into a heated exchange, other times pulling a guest aside for a quieter, more strategic conversation. She thrives in this atmosphere, a queen equally at home discussing Descartes' philosophy as she is maneuvering alliances. Much later, when the salon has dwindled to a handful of guests, she sits by the fire with a small group of trusted friends. The talk turns to her future, and she hints, almost playfully, at the idea of leaving Sweden behind. A crown, she says, is heavy in more ways than one. Her tone is light, but the words hang in the air, You leave the palace with the cold wind biting at your cheeks, your mind turning over the paradox of Christina of Sweden. Her danger lies not in military might or ruthless purges, but in her refusal to be bound by expectation. She is a queen who sees the throne as one role among many, and who is entirely capable of stepping away from it on her own terms, leaving an entire kingdom to wonder if they ever truly knew her. The streets of Jerusalem are thick with dust this summer, the heat rising from the stones in shimmering waves. Pilgrims crowd the narrow lanes, their voices a jumble of Latin, Greek, and Arabic. You pass beneath the archway into the royal quarter, where the air is only marginally cooler, and step into the palace of Queen Isabella of Jerusalem, a woman whose crown was both a blessing and a curse in the last, fragile years of the Crusader kingdom. Born around 1159, Isabella was the eldest daughter of King Amalric I of Jerusalem. The mainstream fact. She became queen in 1186, inheriting a realm already under siege from Saladin's forces. Her reign was defined by crisis, culminating in the catastrophic loss of Jerusalem to the Ayyubid armies in 1187. Yet through it all, Isabella clung to her authority, even when her decisions alienated allies and fueled dissent. You find her in the audience hall, sunlight pouring through latticed windows onto the mosaic floor. She sits upright on a carved chair, her gown a deep shade of blue, her hair braided and crowned with a simple circlet. Before her, a group of knights and nobles argue over the readiness of the kingdom's defences. Isabella listens without betraying emotion, then announces her decision with quiet finality. The muster will proceed immediately, regardless of dissent. Her voice is calm, but it leaves no space for negotiation. Here's your quirky tidbit. Isabella defied the High Court of Jerusalem by insisting on crowning her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as king, even when the barons opposed him. According to chronicles, she offered to give up her crown entirely on the condition that she be allowed to choose her next husband. When the court agreed, she stunned them by placing the crown back on her own head and naming Guy on the spot. It was political theatre at its most audacious. Historians still argue whether Isabella's loyalty to Guy was a fatal flaw or an act of calculated unity in the face of division. Some blame her for sticking with an unpopular consort. Others suggest she understood that open division at the top would doom the kingdom faster than any siege. Watching her now, you can believe both arguments. She is a woman who makes her choices and stands by them, for better or worse. In the afternoon, you accompany her to the battlements overlooking the city. The horizon is hazy, but the threat from Saladin's forces feels close enough to touch. Isabella leans against the warm stone, her eyes scanning the distant hills. She asks her captain about the condition of the siege engines, the supply of arrows, the morale of the troops. Every answer is weighed, and when she speaks, it's to order more provisions sent to the outer garrisons. Later, back inside, the chapel is filled with the scent of incense as Isabella kneels in prayer. The light from the candles casts long shadows over her face, softening the lines of strain that rule has etched there. Her faith is not for show. You can see in her stillness that it is both anchor and armor. That evening, the great hall fills with the clatter of armor and the murmur of worried voices. Messengers arrive from the north with grim news. Another fortress has fallen. Isabella rises, thanks them for their service, and then addresses the room with measured words. She speaks of courage, of duty, of the kingdom's sacred role. For a moment, the fear ebbs. Late at night, you find her in her private chambers, poring over a map by lamplight. Her finger traces the routes still open for reinforcements, the possible fallback positions if the worst happens. The candle burns low, but she does not rise until the plan is clear in her mind. You leave the palace with the sound of distant chanting drifting from the churches. Isabella of Jerusalem remains at her table, a queen whose danger lies in her unshakable resolve. She will not step aside, even as the walls close in. And whether history remembers her as steadfast or stubborn, it will remember that in the hour of Jerusalem's greatest trial, she chose to stand her ground. The morning sun spills over the harbour of Barcelona, turning the water to gold. The salty tang of the sea mixes with the aroma of fresh bread from nearby stalls, and the calls of merchants float up toward the palace perched on the hill. Inside its airy halls, cooled by sea breezes, Queen Isabella of Aragon moves like someone who knows that her influence stretches far beyond these walls across the Mediterranean and into the intricate web of dynastic politics. Born in 1470, Isabella was the daughter of King John II of Aragon and became Queen of Portugal through her marriage to King Manuel I. The mainstream fact: her marriage was part of a careful strategy to strengthen ties between Aragon and Portugal, binding two maritime powers in an alliance that could rival even Castile's reach. She carried with her not just noble blood, but the negotiating leverage of her father's kingdom and the respect earned from her own diplomatic skill. You find her in the audience hall, sunlight slanting across the tiled floor. She greets a group of Genoese merchants, her voice smooth as she asks about the health of their ships and the speed of their voyages. Each question is a subtle probe, gathering intelligence about trade routes and political undercurrents. Her smile is warm, but every word is calculated, weighing profit against politics. Here's your quirky tidbit. Isabella was known for hosting elaborate maritime-themed feasts, where dishes were shaped like sea creatures, and the hall was decorated to resemble the deck of a ship. Chroniclers say these gatherings doubled as diplomatic performances, reminding foreign guests of her family's naval strength, without ever mentioning the size of their fleets. It was dinner as soft power. Historians still argue whether Isabella's role was more symbolic than practical in her marriage alliance, or whether she exercised genuine influence over Portugal's policy toward the Mediterranean. Some portray her as a dutiful link in a dynastic chain. Others suggest she was a quiet force shaping trade agreements and naval strategies. Watching her now, it's easy to believe she was far more than a ceremonial bridge between crowns. In the afternoon, you follow her to the palace gardens, where orange trees shade gravel paths. She pauses by a fountain, speaking with an advisor from Lisbon about the latest reports from the African coast. Her tone is even, but her questions are precise. How secure are the ports? Which governors are trustworthy? Which merchants might be swayed with better terms? Each answer is filed away, a piece in a broader puzzle she's assembling. Later, in a smaller council chamber, she sits with both Portuguese and Aragonese envoys. The conversation turns to the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. Isabella listens, interjects with quiet but firm corrections, and proposes a shared patrol system for certain waters. The plan, presented as a gesture of unity, also ensures that her influence will extend into territories where neither crown has uncontested control. As evening falls, a banquet is held in her honor. The long tables are laden with seafood, lobster, mussels, and fish, arranged in elaborate displays. Minstrels play songs of seafaring heroics, and guests from multiple kingdoms trade toasts. Isabella moves among them effortlessly, switching languages as she goes, her laughter light but her eyes always attentive. When the hall finally empties, she retreats to her private chambers. A chest sits open beside her desk, filled with letters from her brothers, from Portuguese ministers, and from foreign merchants. She reads each carefully, setting aside those that need a personal reply. When she writes, her hand is steady, the phrasing deliberate, equal parts charm and quiet insistence. You step out into the warm night, the hum of the harbour drifting up toward the palace. Isabella of Aragon remains behind, her candle burning in the high window. Her danger lies in her ability to braid loyalty, trade, and influence into a rope strong enough to span seas. She doesn't command the fleets herself, but she ensures they sail in the direction she chooses, and that no one quite realizes it until they've already set course. The city of Bourges hums quietly in the soft light of late afternoon, its streets smelling faintly of fresh bread and wood smoke. Beyond the market square rises the palace of Jacques Coeur, a place of intricate stonework and quiet wealth. But the real power in this moment rests in the nearby residence where Yolande of Aragon, Dowager Queen of Sicily and mother-in-law to the King of France, is holding court in her own style, calm, deliberate, and with the precision of a master strategist. Born in 1384, Yolande was the daughter of King John I of Aragon and became Queen of Naples and Sicily through marriage to Louis II of Anjou. The mainstream fact: she played a decisive role in supporting the French crown during the Hundred Years' War, particularly in securing the eventual rise of Charles VII. Her patronage, political connections, and personal resources helped sustain the French cause in its darkest hours. You find her in a richly furnished sola, the windows open to let in a cool breeze. She is listening to a young captain describe troop movements near the Loire. Her questions are measured, each one cutting closer to the heart of the matter. When he falters, she fills in the details herself, demonstrating that her information network rivals any king's intelligence service. Here's your quirky tidbit. Yolande was known for personally vetting letters before they reached Charles VII when he was still a dauphin in hiding. Chroniclers claim she sometimes rewrote passages to keep him from making rash decisions or from realizing just how precarious his position was. It was motherly protection wrapped in political foresight, the 15th century version of managing a head of state's inbox. Historians still argue whether Yolande's influence over Charles VII was primarily maternal or political. Some believe she genuinely saw herself as a guardian of the crown's survival. Others think she viewed France as a crucial component of her family's own power base. Watching her now, you sense she never saw a contradiction between the two. In the late afternoon, she walks the gardens with a small entourage. Her steps are slow, but her mind is quick. She asks an advisor about the status of a particular nobleman's loyalty, listens to the answer, and then quietly instructs that a marriage alliance be pursued to bind him closer to the royal cause. The advisor nods, already mentally compiling a list of eligible candidates. Later, in a candlelit chamber, Yolande meets with envoys from Brittany. The negotiations are polite but firm. She offers aid, but only under terms that ensure long-term allegiance. The Bretons, sensing they've been outmaneuvered but unwilling to lose her support, accept with gracious words. By the time the ink dries on the agreement, she has secured not just troops, but a political foothold that will outlast the current campaign. That evening, the household gathers for supper. The table is laden with roasted fowl, fresh greens, and spiced wine. Yolande sits at the head, speaking lightly of poetry and courtly manners, but you notice that each guest she addresses leaves the table with a task, a promise, or a subtle reminder of their debt to her. After supper, she retreats to her private study. The room smells of wax and parchment, the desk piled with correspondence. She reads a letter from her daughter-in-law, Queen Marie of Anjou, and smiles faintly before dictating a reply that mixes familial warmth with precise political instruction. You step outside into the cooling night, the air tinged with the faint scent of lavender from the palace gardens. Behind you, Yolande of Aragon remains at her desk, her candlelight glowing in the window. Her danger lies not in military command or public spectacle, but in the quiet, relentless knitting together of loyalties, threads so fine they are almost invisible, yet strong enough to hold a crown in place. And when that crown finally sat firmly on Charles VII's head, it was Yolande's unseen hand that had steadied it all along. The wind sweeping through the cloisters of Westminster Abbey smells faintly of beeswax and damp stone. Inside the royal apartments, the hush is deep enough to make every footstep echo. Here, Queen Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I of England, moves with an ease that disguises the quiet power she wields. She is a figure of grace and piety, but beneath that lies a political mind sharp enough to balance the fractious court and the ever-prickly church. Born around 1080, Matilda was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and Queen Margaret, herself a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. The mainstream fact: by marrying Henry I, Matilda united Norman rulers with the Old English royal blood, helping stabilize the kingdom after the Norman conquest. Her position as both queen and symbolic bridge between cultures gave her leverage few consorts could match. You find her in a high-ceilinged hall, speaking with a bishop about the appointment of an abbot. Her tone is serene, but her phrasing leaves little doubt she expects her preference to prevail. She listens to the bishop's concerns, nodding gently, then reframes the matter as a benefit to both the church and the crown. A neat piece of diplomacy that ends with the bishop agreeing to her choice. Here's your quirky tidbit. Matilda was renowned for personally tending to the sick and washing the feet of the poor during Lent. Chroniclers note that she sometimes slipped away from court in modest clothing to perform acts of charity anonymously. It was not just an expression of faith, but also a way to win the love of the people without the trappings of royal ceremony. Historians still argue whether her influence over Henry I was direct in matters of state or mostly confined to church affairs. Some see her as a quietly decisive force in key appointments and negotiations. Others think her political role has been overstated in favor of her saintly image. Standing here, you sense that her gentle reputation was itself a kind of armor disarming in public, but formidable in private conversation. In the afternoon she walks the gardens, the crisp air lifting the edge of her veil. She pauses to speak with a group of petitioners who have been waiting for hours. Rather than simply hearing their grievances, she takes notes, asking questions that suggest she's already thinking about practical solutions. The petitioners bow deeply as she moves on, their expressions transformed from anxiety to relief. Later, in a smaller chamber lined with illuminated manuscripts, Matilda meets with a scribe to review a charter. The document grants new privileges to a monastery, but also ensures the crown retains a measure of oversight. She traces the Latin text with one finger, her corrections precise and without hesitation. As evening falls, the court gathers for supper. Matilda sits beside Henry, their conversation a quiet counterpoint to the louder voices down the table. She leans in occasionally to murmur a comment that makes him glance toward a particular nobleman or envoy, as though re-evaluating them in light of her observation. After the meal, she withdraws to her chapel for compline. The candlelight warms the stone walls, and her voice blends with the low chant of the monks. Watching her, you understand that her piety is genuine, but it also reinforces her political position. No one can challenge her without appearing to oppose both crown and faith. When you finally step out into the cool night air, you realize Matilda of Scotland's danger lies in her mastery of balance. She bridges Norman and Saxon, crown and church, public charity and private influence. In a court where survival often depends on brute force or sharp intrigue, she rules through the subtler strength of being indispensable to both God's house and the king's, and that, perhaps, is the most enduring kind of power. The tide along the River Thames runs swift this morning, carrying the cries of gulls up to the grey towers of Windsor Castle. Inside, the corridors are cool and hushed, the thick stone walls muffling the sounds of the outside world. This is the court of Joan of Navarre, Queen, consort of England, stepmother to Henry V, and a woman who learned quickly that a foreign-born queen must be twice as careful and twice as clever to keep her place. Born around 1368, Joan was the daughter of Charles II of Navarre. The mainstream fact: she first married John IV, Duke of Brittany, and after his death wed Henry IV of England in 1403. Her marriage to Henry secured an alliance and brought her considerable wealth, but it also set her on a path that would see her accused years later of witchcraft and plotting the king's death. She survived the scandal and imprisonment, eventually regaining her freedom and much of her influence. You find her in a small audience chamber, the fire snapping in the grate as she speaks with a merchant from Bristol. She questions him about the state of the wool trade, her interest practical rather than idle. The exchange is cordial, yet you can feel the merchant's awareness that a misplaced word could echo far beyond these walls. Joan listens carefully, offering nothing in her expression to suggest agreement or displeasure. Here's your quirky tidbit. Joan reportedly travelled to England for her marriage, with a personal fortune in jewels so vast it required special guards along the journey. Chroniclers loved to list each piece: gold girdles, ruby-encrusted brooches, pearl-studded headdresses, turning her arrival into a spectacle of wealth that subtly announced her position before she ever spoke a word. Historians still argue whether the witchcraft accusations brought against her by Henry V were born from genuine suspicion or political convenience. Some suggest they were a way to neutralize her influence and seize her fortune. Others think they were fueled by superstition and court rivalries. Watching her now, you see a woman who has learned to mask every flicker of emotion, revealing nothing unless she chooses. In the afternoon, she walks the outer gardens, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. A knight approaches with news from France, and she listens without interrupting. When he finishes, she asks two questions that cut directly to the strategic heart of his report. The knight bows, visibly impressed or perhaps wary that she has grasped the implications so quickly. Later, in a private council, she sits at the far end of the table, her hands folded neatly. She does not speak often, but when she does, the room stills. Her comments are precise, informed, and offered in a tone that makes them difficult to dismiss without seeming foolish. As evening falls, the great hall fills with the warm light of torches. Joan sits in a high-backed chair, receiving courtiers with a practiced smile. She asks after their families, their estates, their travels, always storing away small pieces of information that might be useful later. After the crowd disperses, she retreats to her private chambers. The flicker of the hearth plays over the polished wood of a large coffer, its lid open to reveal documents, letters, and a few pieces of her famous jewelry. She selects a ring, turning it over thoughtfully before slipping it on her finger, as if reclaiming a part of herself the accusations could never touch. You leave Windsor with the knowledge that Joan of Navarre's danger lies in her ability to endure. She survived the treacherous waters of 2 royal courts, navigated imprisonment, and emerged with her dignity intact. In a world where a queen's fall could be swift and final, her survival is proof that resilience can be as sharp a weapon as any blade. The winter sun over Westminster is pale and thin, barely warming the frozen gardens of the royal palace. Inside, the scent of rushes recently strewn on the floors mingles with the faint aroma of beeswax from the polished panelling. Here, Queen Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III of England, presides over a court that blends the refined manners of her homeland with the hard, restless politics of Plantagenet England. Born in 1223, Eleanor was the daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Provence. The mainstream fact: she married Henry III in 1236, bringing with her a family network that would shape English politics for decades. Her Provençal relatives gained high positions, sparking resentment among native barons and fueling the tensions that would lead to the Second Barons' War. Yet Eleanor herself navigated these storms with a mix of charm, cultural influence, and a will of iron. You find her in a long gallery hung with rich tapestries from Flanders, sunlight catching the jeweled clasps of her gown. She is reading a petition from a London merchant, her lips pursed slightly. When she speaks, it is to ask a pointed question about trade routes to Gascony, revealing an economic insight her critics would prefer to pretend she lacks. Here's your quirky tidbit. Eleanor was an enthusiastic gardener and personally oversaw the planting of exotic species in the royal gardens. Chroniclers note that she often walked there with envoys, using the setting as a subtle stage for negotiations where the fragrance of imported roses and the sight of rare fruit trees quietly reinforced her family's far-reaching connections. Historians still argue whether Eleanor was a divisive foreign influence or a pragmatic queen trying to secure her family's position in a suspicious court. Some see her as a cause of discontent that weakened Henry's reign. Others view her as an indispensable ally who kept the monarchy afloat during its most vulnerable years. Watching her now, it's clear she's aware of every whisper and weighs each one for its potential danger or advantage. In the afternoon, you follow her to a small council chamber. Henry sits at the head of the table, but Eleanor leans in to murmur in his ear, occasionally passing him a folded scrap of parchment. When a dispute arises between 2 barons over a royal charter, she offers a compromise phrased so that each man can claim victory. The tension breaks, replaced by reluctant nods. Later, she rides out along the Thames in a covered barge, her ladies attending her. The journey is ostensibly for leisure, but you notice she stops at the wharves to speak with ship captains, inquiring about their cargoes and the ports they've visited. Each conversation adds to her mental ledger of who controls which goods and where their loyalties might lie. That evening, the court assembles for a feast. Minstrels play Provençal songs alongside English ballads, a blend of cultures mirroring the Queen's own balancing act. Eleanor moves gracefully among her guests, speaking in both languages, charming even those who mutter about her in private. When a particularly vocal critic rises to leave, she draws him into conversation so deftly that he departs smiling. After the hall empties, she retreats to her private chamber. There, by the glow of a single candle, she reads letters from her sisters, each married into a different European court, and drafts replies that weave together family news, political advice, and discreet requests for favours. The letters will travel quietly but carry weight far beyond their delicate parchment. You step back into the frosty night, the moonlight glinting on the Thames. Behind you, Eleanor of Provence is still awake, her mind as carefully cultivated as her gardens. Her danger lies in her ability to turn soft words into firm outcomes, to knit her family's fortunes into the fabric of English politics so tightly that pulling one thread could unravel the whole. In a court that often judged queens by their beauty alone, she made sure her true legacy was power that could bloom in any season. The sun dips low over the red-tiled roofs of Toledo, casting a warm glow on the Tagus River as it curves around the city. Bells ring from the cathedral tower, their echo threading through narrow streets to the Alcazar, where Queen Isabella of Portugal holds her court. The air inside is heavy with the scent of olive oil lamps and polished cedar, a rich stillness that seems to wrap around her like armour. Born in 1428, Isabella was the daughter of Infante John of Portugal, and became Queen of Castile through her marriage to King John II in 1447. The mainstream fact: her influence was such that during her husband's illness and later in moments of political unrest, she acted as regent, steering Castile through turbulent years of factional conflict. Her court became both a political nerve centre and a place of refuge for loyalists during volatile times. You find her in the council chamber, the long table crowded with parchments, seals, and maps. A delegation from Segovia is presenting grievances about taxation. Isabella listens intently, her gaze steady, her hands folded. When the spokesman finishes, she responds in measured tones, offering a restructuring of the levies that eases the burden without weakening the royal treasury. It's a deft compromise enough to quiet dissent without giving up real control. Here's your quirky tidbit. Isabella was known to keep a personal cabinet of rare herbs and remedies, and she occasionally prepared them herself for trusted courtiers or visiting envoys. Whether this was a genuine act of care or a calculated display of knowledge and generosity, it added to her reputation as a queen who could heal divisions as well as people. Historians still argue whether her regency was driven more by loyalty to her husband's vision or by her own ambition to shape Castile. Some portray her as a stabilizing force who prevented the kingdom from fracturing. Others suggest she was consolidating her personal authority behind the scenes. Watching her now, you suspect both readings are true. She governs with a steady hand, but every decision also secures her own position. In the afternoon, you walk with her along the fortress walls, the winter wind tugging at the edges of her dark mantle. She pauses to look out over the river, speaking softly about the importance of controlling its crossings. Trade and armies both follow the bridges, she says, and whoever controls the bridges controls the realm. It's the kind of observation that reveals a mind always mapping the invisible lines of power. Later, a private audience is held in her apartments. A young knight kneels before her, delivering a sealed letter from the frontier. She breaks the wax, reads quickly, and then gives him instructions that are as much about political messaging as military action. The knight departs looking both relieved and wary, as if he has been entrusted with more than he expected. That evening, the court assembles for a modest but well-orchestrated supper. The dishes are simple stewed meats, fresh bread, citrus from the southern groves, but the seating arrangements speak volumes. Isabella places rival nobles side by side, forcing civility under her watchful gaze. She speaks to each guest in turn, drawing out their concerns, smoothing over tensions, and planting the seeds of future alliances. After the meal, she withdraws to a smaller chamber where only a single oil lamp burns. On the desk are letters from Portugal, Aragon, and the Papal States. She reads each one, occasionally dipping her pen to add a note in the margin before passing it to her secretary for drafting a reply. Her correspondence is a quiet web of influence, threads stretching far beyond Castile's borders. When you step out into the night, the stars are bright over Toledo, and the river glints below like a silver ribbon. Behind you, Isabella of Portugal is still at her desk, her silhouette steady against the lamplight. Her danger lies in her patience, her willingness to work in the shadows, to weave policy and diplomacy together until her authority is unshakable. In a kingdom prone to sudden storms, she has made herself the constant horizon. The dawn light over Dunfermline Abbey spills pale gold across the stone walls, catching the frost still clinging to the grass. The bells toll a slow, measured peal as you make your way into the royal residence nearby. Here, Queen Margaret of Scotland, later canonized as Saint Margaret, once walked these halls with quiet steps that belied the strength beneath her gentleness. She is remembered for her deep piety, but also for the subtle and enduring way she shaped the kingdom's politics and culture. Born around 1045, Margaret was the granddaughter of an English king, raised partly in exile in Hungary. The mainstream fact: she married King Malcolm III of Scotland around 1070, bringing with her not just a noble pedigree but a refinement of courtly and religious life that left a lasting mark. She reformed church practices, encouraged education, and acted as an advisor to her husband in matters both diplomatic and domestic. You find her in a modest but well-kept chamber, seated near the hearth with a piece of embroidery in her lap. She listens as a steward reads a list of petitions from the local burghers. Margaret pauses her needlework to ask for clarification on one request about a market toll, and suggests a compromise that supports the traders without depriving the crown. Her voice is soft, but there is no mistaking the authority in it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Margaret was known to read scripture aloud in both Latin and English at meals, sometimes stopping mid-passage to question her listeners on the meaning of a verse. It was part devotion, part instruction, a queen's version of keeping her court intellectually awake along with their bodies. Historians still argue whether her influence over Malcolm was a matter of personal devotion or strategic guidance. Some believe she acted primarily as a spiritual counselor. Others point to her role in encouraging alliances and adopting certain English customs as evidence of calculated statecraft. Watching her now, you can see how the two might be intertwined: faith guiding politics, politics protecting faith. In the afternoon, she walks with you to the Abbey church, her pace unhurried. She pauses to greet a group of monks, asking after the progress of a manuscript they are copying. Her knowledge of their work is specific. She inquires about the ink supply, the condition of the vellum. For her, fostering religious life is not just about attending Mass, but about ensuring the infrastructure that sustains it. Later, she visits the kitchens, inspecting the preparations for the daily almsgiving to the poor. She speaks to the cooks about providing extra bread and fish for the infirm. Her concern is practical and immediate, but it also reinforces her reputation as a queen who embodies charity, an image that strengthens her moral authority as much as it feeds her subjects. As evening falls, the royal family gathers in the great hall. Malcolm sits beside her, occasionally leaning in to consult her quietly about matters brought forward by the lords. She listens carefully, offering advice with a glance or a brief phrase, never overstepping publicly yet clearly shaping the decisions being made. After supper, Margaret withdraws to a small chapel lit by flickering candles. She kneels for a long while, her head bowed, the stillness broken only by the low murmur of prayer. When she rises, it is with the air of someone who has found her next step as much in reflection as in counsel. You leave Dunfermline that night with the sound of the Abbey bells in your ears. Margaret of Scotland's danger lies not in military might or political intrigue, but in the kind of influence that seeps into every corner of a realm, soft enough to be welcomed, steady enough to be unstoppable. In a court where power often wore armour, hers was woven into the very fabric of Scotland's identity. The desert wind swirls through the colonnades of Palmyra, carrying the scent of dust and far-off spices. The sun glints on pale limestone, and the streets hum with the chatter of merchants from Rome, Persia, and Arabia. Above it all, in the fortified palace, Queen Zenobia sits as both ruler and strategist, her gaze fixed beyond the horizon toward an empire she intends to challenge. Born around 240 CE in the city of Palmyra, Zenobia rose to power after the assassination of her husband, King Odenathus. The mainstream fact: she took the throne as regent for her young son, but within a few years had conquered Egypt, much of the Levant, and parts of Asia Minor, effectively creating an empire that rivaled Rome itself. Her defiance would eventually provoke the full might of Emperor Aurelian's legions. You find her in an open-air audience hall, shaded by carved stone arches. She wears a diadem of gold, her gown of deep indigo edged with pearls. A Roman envoy kneels before her, reading a letter from Aurelian that demands her submission. Zenobia listens without interruption, then responds in a voice that carries through the colonnade. "Tell your emperor that Palmyra bows to none." The courtiers around her exchange quick, sharp glances. They know the weight of those words. Here's your quirky tidbit. Zenobia reportedly rode long distances on horseback alongside her troops, keeping pace with the cavalry without showing fatigue. Chroniclers claim she could ride all day, eat only sparingly, and still preside over councils at night. It was as much a message as a habit. No one could accuse her of ruling from a cushioned seat. Historians still argue whether her ambition was pure rebellion against Rome or a calculated effort to protect Palmyra's independence during a time of imperial weakness. Some say she sought to replace Rome in the east. Others see her as a temporary steward trying to hold her lands together until stability returned. Watching her now, it's clear she is thinking not in months or years, but in generations. In the afternoon, she walks the palace terrace overlooking the caravan routes. She points out the dust of an approaching convoy and remarks on the price of silk, the weight of the pepper harvest, and the arrival of Nabatean traders. For Zenobia, commerce is as much a weapon as the spear control the routes, and you control the fortunes of empires. Later, in her council chamber, maps are spread wide across a cedar table. She moves small bronze figures to indicate troop positions, listening to her generals debate the merits of fortifying the Euphrates crossings versus striking directly into Roman Syria. When the argument stalls, she cuts through with a plan that blends defense and offense, ensuring no route to Palmyra is left exposed. As evening falls, the palace glows with lamplight. Scholars gather in the library to read aloud from Greek and Aramaic texts, while musicians play soft melodies. Zenobia drifts between them, engaging in discussions of philosophy and history as easily as she discusses military supply chains. Her court is both a sanctuary of learning and the nerve center of an empire in defiance. Late at night, she stands on the balcony, the desert stretching away under a moonlit sky. Her hands rest on the stone balustrade as she watches the flicker of campfires beyond the city walls, her army, waiting for her command. You leave the palace with the sense that Zenobia's danger lies in her ability to be many things at once: a warrior who can outpace her soldiers, a scholar who can hold her own with philosophers, and a ruler whose ambition can set an entire empire on edge. In her presence, Palmyra feels less like a city-state and more like the heart of a new world order, one that will not yield easily to Rome. The highlands of Georgia are shrouded in early morning mist, the peaks of the Caucasus Mountains glowing faintly under the first touch of sunlight. You follow a winding road into Tbilisi, where the streets hum with traders from Persia, Byzantium, and the steppes. At the royal palace, the banners of the Bagratid dynasty hang in deep crimson and gold, and within its stone walls, Queen Tamar holds court confident, serene, and every inch the sovereign of a golden age. Born in 1160, Tamar was crowned co-ruler with her father, King George III, before becoming sole ruler of Georgia in 1184. The mainstream fact: her reign is remembered as the zenith of medieval Georgian power, marked by military victories, cultural flourishing, and territorial expansion that stretched the kingdom's influence from the Black Sea to the Caspian. Her title was not queen but king, a deliberate choice to underscore her supreme authority. You find her in the audience hall, where sunlight spills across mosaic floors in geometric patterns. She is receiving emissaries from the Seljuk Sultanate, their ornate robes shimmering in the light. Tamar greets them with courtesy, but there's a steel edge beneath her calm demeanor. Her questions are direct, her tone unflinching. She will not be underestimated simply because she wears a crown without a beard. Here's your quirky tidbit. Tamar once led a war council that included both her generals and her court poets, insisting that the spirit of the nation was as vital to victory as strategy. Chronicles suggest she saw cultural pride as a form of warfare, a belief that art and literature could rally the heart of Georgia as surely as swords could defend its borders. Historians still argue whether Tamar's success was due more to her personal leadership or to the foundations laid by her father. Some emphasize her ability to appoint capable commanders and delegate authority. Others focus on her shrewd use of diplomacy, including strategic marriages and alliances. Watching her now, it's clear she understands that kingship is as much about building trust as it is about issuing commands. In the afternoon, she walks the palace gardens, the air heavy with the scent of blooming pomegranates. She stops to speak with a group of merchants newly arrived from Trebizond, inquiring about the stability of trade routes through Anatolia. Every detail matters to her: prices of grain, the safety of mountain passes, the loyalty of port governors. Later, in her war council, a large map of the Caucasus covers the table. Reports arrive of raids along the eastern frontier, and her commanders argue about the best response. Tamar listens quietly, then issues an order to dispatch troops while also sending envoys to negotiate with the chieftains responsible. Her decision is a blend of strength and tact, meant to secure victory without breeding long-term resentment. As night falls, the great hall is lit by hundreds of oil lamps. Musicians play the panduri and the duduk, while guests dine on lamb stew, fresh herbs, and sweet wine. Tamar moves easily among her court, sharing a warm laugh with nobles, listening intently to visiting scholars, and offering a steady gaze to anyone who seeks her approval. Later, in her private study, she reads a letter from a distant ally requesting aid. Her response is thoughtful, balancing generosity with the reminder that loyalty must be mutual. She seals the letter with a press of her signet ring, the emblem of a king in a queen's form. When you step outside, the night air is cool and filled with the sound of the Kura River rushing below. Behind you, Tamar remains in her hall, the embodiment of Georgia's strength and ambition. Her danger lies in her ability to weave power, culture, and diplomacy into a single, unbreakable fabric, one that will define her reign long after the mist lifts from the highlands. The marble domes of Constantinople gleam in the late afternoon sun, their reflections dancing on the waters of the Golden Horn. The streets below are alive with the calls of merchants and the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, but within the walls of the imperial palace, a quieter tension hums. This is the court of Theodora of Byzantium, empress, reformer, and political survivor in a city where intrigue is as common as incense. Born around 500 CE, Theodora's early life was far from royal. The mainstream fact: she rose from humble beginnings, possibly as the daughter of a bear trainer, to marry Emperor Justinian I and become one of the most influential women in Byzantine history. Known for her intelligence, political acumen, and unwavering will, she shaped policy on everything from legal rights for women to foreign diplomacy. You find her in a long, colonnaded hall overlooking the palace gardens. She is seated on a low couch, surrounded by advisors debating the empire's response to unrest in the provinces. Theodora listens without moving, her face serene. When she speaks, Her words slice through the din like a finely honed blade, direct, measured, and impossible to ignore. Here's your quirky tidbit. Theodora famously refused to flee during the Nika riots of 532, when much of Constantinople was in flames and the mob threatened the throne. According to Procopius, she told Justinian that royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. It was a statement equal parts defiance and fatalism, and it may have convinced him to stand his ground and crush the revolt. Historians still argue whether Theodora's power was exercised primarily through persuasion, or whether she acted as an equal partner in governance. Some portray her as Justinian's indispensable advisor, others as a co-ruler in all but title. Watching her now, it's clear she has no interest in separating the two. Her authority is both personal and political, and she wields it openly. In the afternoon, you follow her into the audience chamber, where petitioners from across the empire present their cases. A woman from Antioch speaks of losing her inheritance to a male cousin. Theodora questions her sharply, then orders an imperial clerk to review the case under the new property laws she helped institute. It is not charity, it is precedent. Later, she meets privately with foreign envoys from the Persian court. The conversation is conducted in a low voice, but the subtle shifts in posture tell you much. An envoy leaning forward at a concession, Theodora's slight smile at a veiled compliment, the final, graceful nod that closes the meeting. Every gesture is a negotiation. As evening falls, the palace baths glow with lamplight. Theodora walks the marble paths barefoot, the warm air carrying the scent of myrrh and roses. Here, she speaks more freely, surrounded only by her most trusted ladies. She discusses court gossip, upcoming festivals, and the latest theological debates, but always with an undercurrent of strategy. Even in leisure, she is working. Later still, in her private chamber, she dictates correspondence to governors in Asia Minor, blending flattery with firm directives. When the scribe departs, she stands at the window, looking out over the darkened city. The sea breeze stirs her hair, and for a moment she seems carved from the same marble as the statues in the palace gardens, immovable, enduring. You leave the imperial compound knowing that Theodora's danger lies in her refusal to accept the limitations of her role. She does not merely influence policy, she shapes the very identity of the empire. And in a city where power can vanish overnight, she has made herself impossible to erase. The torches have burned low now, my friend, and the courts we've walked through are fading into the quiet of memory. The clatter of armor, the murmured intrigues, the rustle of silk gowns, they all seem softer, blurred by the stillness that comes after long stories. You've stood in the shadow of queens who ruled from gilded thrones and in candle-lit chambers, who commanded armies and whispers alike. Some shaped their worlds with mercy, others with calculated steel, but all shared the same unyielding thread, the refusal to be only what the world expected of them. The air is slower now, as if the night itself is listening, and the flicker of imagined torchlight gives way to the gentler glow of a single lamp. You can picture the crowns being set aside, the royal robes folded away, the sound of their footsteps fading into corridors that now belong to silence. Outside, the wind settles. Inside, the last words spoken in council still seem to hang in the air, waiting for someone to carry them forward. Let your thoughts rest here. Let the weight of the past settle into something light, like dust in a shaft of morning light. Whatever you remember of these dangerous queens, whether their courage, their cunning, or the quiet moments they guarded for themselves, let it drift into the calm. You are far from their wars and their courts now, safe in the soft distance of time. The stories have done their work, and the night can take them the rest of the way. Sleep well, knowing history will keep their watch until morning. Sweet dreams.